Good afternoon, everybody. If we're serious about human-centered collections, then the first question we've got to ask ourselves is this: how well do we really understand that person behind the debt? Now, this afternoon, I'm just going to briefly talk to you about our latest product, Know Your Vulnerable Customer, and how it was built specifically to answer that question. So I'll kick this off with a tiny bit of background because it's quite relevant in terms of where it all came from. It's quite interesting. So we came up with the concept for this back in COVID. So by 2020, Data on Demand had already been delivering data solutions to the credit collections and ID verification industries for years. COVID comes along, country's on lockdown. By then, the regulators had already started to make it clear that they expected both businesses to recognize vulnerable customers, but to also ensure that once they'd been recognized, they were getting fairer treatment and better outcomes. So we read the FCA's Financial Lives survey and saw the characteristics of what defined vulnerability. We sort of recognized that a lot of those characteristics were already present in our high-cost short-term loan applications data, which at the time was a major part of our FinTrace or collections product. But that was the light bulb moment. That was the moment that we realized we could take that data and start to build something meaningful. So we came up with the concept for a product called ID View, which in turn became the foundations for Know Your Vulnerable Customer. But what was interesting as we researched this market from a data perspective was there was no single supplier that could provide data that covered all aspects of vulnerability. So we wanted something that brought everything together: health, life events, financial resilience, and capability, but all in one place. So just like with all our other products, it was going to be a case of combining multiple data sources and effectively trying to stitch them together into this fully enriched single customer view. Fast forward to today, that's exactly what we've done. So partnering with organizations such as the Vulnerability Registration Service, Policy and Practice, Mortality Manifest, Infineon, and the Insolvency Service, we're now in a position where we can provide over 100 vulnerability insights into organizations' databases with over 14.5 million records. So, how do we work with organizations to ensure more responsible collections? Well, the first thing we do with any organization that we work in is really try to understand their objectives. Why are they looking to identify vulnerable customers, and what are they hoping to achieve? Now, that process, whether we end up working with the client long-term or not, will always start with what we call a free customer vulnerability report on their data. Now, that report will show not only the volume and range of insights that we've found, but it'll show what data sources we've used, why we've used them, and how that data can be applied in the short, the medium, and the long term. Now, when we present these initial headline vulnerability figures to a customer, they are usually blown away. I mean, it really opens their eyes as to the size and scalability of vulnerability within their list. But from there, we can then start to refine things. So we'll dig deeper and we'll focus on the areas that matter to them most. We'll provide suggestions and strategies that will align with their objectives, and we'll help them build this really strong business case as to how to use vulnerability data moving forward. So to bring this into the context of human-centered collections, I'm going to use this recent report as an example. So we're working with a customer who serves a known subprime customer base. And we took a monthly portfolio of their customers, which was around 750,000. So big base, and as you'd expect, their vulnerability rates were high overall because it was subprime. They were around the 40% mark. Now, we went away and dug a little bit deeper on it and said, right, well, okay, but 1 in 10 are currently vulnerable, 1 in 13 are highly vulnerable, and 1 in 5 are historically vulnerable. Now, the biggest volumes with regard to insights, by the way, were people borrowing for emergencies, which you'd expect, but also recent bereavements in the family, unemployment, and then health and capability issues like mental health, physical disabilities, that sort of stuff. Now, because their vulnerability volumes were so high, operationally, trying to tackle all this in one go would have been incredibly challenging. So the first part of the project with these guys was literally consulting with them to find out which audiences we were going to tackle first. This is a classic example of where we break the project down into stages, focusing on the highly vulnerable people first and making them the priority. So our recommendation with these guys was to focus on the highly vulnerable people who were sat in arrears. These are people who are not failing to pay by choice, but they're failing to pay due to changes in their circumstances, such as negative life events or other forms of disruption. The key is distinguishing between those who won't pay and those who can't pay. And we can help with all of that. And as part of that consultation, we'll then discuss the strategies with regard to communicating with these people, specifically the tone, the messaging, and the frequency of the contact to ensure that any communication that goes out is supportive, it's proportionate, and it's appropriate to that customer's individual circumstances. All this data can then be embedded into their systems, so they can send relevant communications out to flagged customers. But equally, when a customer contacts them, the contact center will be able to see that customer has just had, let's say, a recent bereavement, and then handle that call correctly in the appropriate manner. That, hopefully, gives you an overview of what Know Your Vulnerable Customer is about, and more importantly, why it matters. Because if collections is going to be truly human-centered, then vulnerability cannot be an afterthought. It has to be embedded into the organizations right from the very beginning. Thank you very much, everybody.
Great insight into vulnerability
Thank
there.
you.
Do we have any questions? Let's have a look. Where should we go? 4K
might have to put my glasses on for these.
I know. Does it use data from Experience Support Hub, or is it competition with that service? So if you take the top question.
No, it doesn't use data from Experience Support Hub. The answer, we use 6. The CEO of the business obviously reviews this on an ongoing basis. We're always looking for new ways in which we can improve Know Your Vulnerable Customer. But as it stands, we have 6 sources that we use, which are 2 of which are loan-based products, one of which is our own, which is a product called ID View. The other one is a product called Infineon, which predominantly bring in financial vulnerability data. We use the Vulnerability Registration Service, which some of you may know something about, but that's self-declared information providing both, not just financial, but physical and mental vulnerabilities to the database as well. We have the Insolvency Service, which is obviously providing data on individuals undergoing financial collapse, bankruptcies, IVAs, debt relief orders, etc. And then we also have Mortality Manifest for deceased data as part of that, and Policy and Practice, who have a benefits calculator. So between the six of them, those are the 6 sources that make up KYVC.
Okay, thank you. How about Eleanor's question? There's a name. Bit of an incentive for this afternoon. If you put your name on a question, more chance of reading it out.
Eleanor, that's quite a tricky question for me, because we focus purely on consumer data. But I will say this: what's interesting. I have been asked this question quite a lot, actually, because the people are quite interested in some of Data on Demand's products, because individuals who are sole traders, in theory, are also consumers as well. Where we notice the biggest patterns with regard to the vulnerability rates, I mean, obviously, dependent on the makeup of the data, subprime stuff is typically very, very high. They can range between typically 30 to 60% vulnerability rates. Whereas if you start to look at a little bit more of a prime audience, the audiences drop a lot. So I would imagine with sole directors and entrepreneurs and so on, the vulnerability rates will probably be lower. But it's quite interesting, because we recently did a report with an organization, a financial services provider, and their audience was very, very prime. I mean, like really prime. It was doctors, dentists, vets, some teachers in there too. And the client was so concerned that they they felt there was literally going to be no vulnerability or hardly any, almost not worth doing. So they were so cautious about it that they literally gave us a sample of data of 6,000 records, bearing in mind their total audience was, total customer base was 250,000. So it's a tiny, tiny sample. But when we did the vulnerability report on that sample, there was vulnerability there. And the vulnerability rates, by the way, were around sort of 3 to 4%, so it was low. But when you've got an audience of 250,000 people, that's still a lot of people. And there were some really serious cases in there as well. We pulled out some really interesting examples of people that had been serious victims of fraud that they needed to reach out to. And it was so compelling that they looked at the audience of 6,000 and went, you know what, let's just go. They didn't even need to see the 250,000 before they agreed to go to a commercial arrangement with us. So, yeah.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All your time for today.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
There's your clicker. Thank you.